Hello, everyone. My name is Nikhil Krishna. I'm a student of Purdue University Electrical and Computer Engineering. I'm currently doing my master's in electrical and computer engineering. I'm also a senior designer at Intel Corporation. Today, I would be presenting my project 2 for ME597, and my topic is decision making and organizational theory. Let's look at how we will be structured today for the presentation. First, we'll go over an introduction and formal definition of decision making. We'll look at different types of decisions made by organization. We'll look at the decision making process, how decisions are made. We will explore what structures are there in an organization to make effective decisions. We'll look at the relationship between how decision making and innovation are related. We'll also look at the details of innovation process. Finally, we will touch a little bit upon the relevance of this project topic with the ME597 course content, and we'll conclude after that. Uh, I would be using the material from the paper, which is being submitted along with the presentation. This presentation will only have the highlights and points for me to talk, and all the detailed discussion around each topic will be given in the complete paper that's being submitted. Let's look at a formal definition of what exactly is decision making. So decision making refers to as choices or alternative courses of action. And sometimes in the context of organizations, it can also be a course of inaction where they don't necessarily do anything about it. But if you really see examples of what kind of decision making made by organizations and what kind of impacts they have, it is really sometimes very big that it results in big financial losses, or it can also be positive where a company makes a strategic change of direction, which helps them steer into a new arena or new business. One of the negative examples of bad decision making was the famous Enron decision, which resulted in $60 billion loss to investors. And only when they actually uncovered the problem, they realized how the financial losses were being hidden in the accounting process of the organization. Sometimes people think that decision making is mainly a very top level management uh, job or something that executives make. But this is always a dangerous mistake, like what Peter Drucker refers to. We will see in this paper and when we walk through that decisions are actually made at every level in an organization, starting all the way from the bottommost part of the hierarchy to all the way to the top, and at every stage and even on a daily basis. Let's see what types of decisions are made by organizations. You can broadly classify this in three different areas, namely strategic decisions, tactical decisions, and operational decisions. If you look at strategic decisions, typically it is taken by the top management, CEO, CTO, or other executives. Some examples is should they downsize, should they enter a new market, should they become an IPO, should they make an acquisition. These are kind of decisions that are called strategic decisions. The next level of decisions are called tactical decisions. These could be, let's say, a unit or a department in an organization. Let's say a marketing department makes a decision on how they should market the product. Or let's say the production environment in a company decides to purchase new equipment to increase the efficiency or the output or throughput of that organization. Then there comes to the third or the last level of decision making called operational decisions. This could be like a change in shift timings, or let's say whether they should make their employees work more or work less to increase or decrease productivity. And it could also be whether they should just pursue an alternative development process for the current product. So this clearly shows what are the different types of decisions which are made and at what levels. Let's look at a very recent example of a strategic decision that was made. Facebook recently decided to change its name to Meta. The decision was arrived after consideration, but mainly such big decisions like changing the name of a company after a decade of existence happens at the CEO level. And this was a very a recent change that where we observed where a decision was made because of the public outcry on the uh, they thought that they could change the way the company is being looked at by changing the name of the company, and also they tried to align it to new product areas like the metaverse that they were trying to enter. Now let's look at a decision-making process in an organization. So decisions, if you if you really go through the articles and the book written by uh, James March and Herbert Simon, he describes decision-making process in three different ways. Decisions as rational choices, decisions as rule-based actions, and decisions as artifacts. So if you really look at the decisions as rational choices, such decisions are generally having a knowledge of alternatives. They have a knowledge of the consequences, and they have a consistent preference ordering and a decision rule. So this is basically a very rational way of doing decisions, just very similar to the material that we went over in the course, where we have a bunch of alternatives and we come up with a utility theory using lottery questions and things like that. This shows that there is actually an ordering of preference of what decision they want to make. For example, this could be a very design dependent decision, like probably they are trying to choose, let's say, a camera for a particular application. Then you have an alternative list and you try to choose and you try to see what could be the consequences of choosing a low resolution, consequences of choosing a high resolution, how cost increases and things like that. Based on these alternatives, preference or a decision rules are built, and uncertainty and ambiguity are generally present in such decisions, and they are removed in a very process oriented methodical manner. The other type of decisions that organization processes use is mainly rule based actions, where we have experimental learning, evolution of invariant rules, or copied rules from other parts or individuals. Let's look at experimental learning. Sometimes organizations tend to use each alternative, try it out like a beta software or a beta process, and then apply that learning to make a decision on a particular choice. Another very important thing is copied rules. What do we mean by copied rules? Copied rules are sometimes called best known methods or methods that have worked in one part of the organization trying to be applied in another part of the organization. One very classic example is from Intel Corporation, which uses what is called copy exact. The copy exact rule, which was introduced in Intel by one of the previous CEOs, was if you could build a process fab in, let's say, Arizona, you should be able to use the exact same method and the exact material, the exact design in another location, let's say in Oregon, and be able to produce the same output. Even though the entire fab was being constructed in a new location, the copy rules or the copy exact rule based methods is one of the processes that they use to come up with rule based actions. The other one is called decision as artifact. So decision making is relatively sometimes, if you really look at it, we think that it's based on, let's say, a process or a rule book or a very rational way of thinking. But always decisions in an organization is made by humans, and humans have a tendency to try to orient or push a decision based on previous experience and past events that would have occurred and their perception of it. One very classic example that we saw in the very recently, in the last 2 years of the pandemic, is that once the COVID-19 pandemic struck, most organizations, especially the ones who are in the information technology and software space, try just took a rule, took a page out of the playbook that employees could work from home just because the employees were used to work from home whenever they were sick before. But if you really see that decision in a very in-depth way, such a decision was made basically based on one or two employees going into a work from home situation, not an entire company moving into that model. Only when they actually implemented work from home did they realize that now they have to looking at an entire organization getting pipelined in the process of logging into the computer network of the organization, everybody trying to coordinate meetings. So if you really see a decision made based on an artifact is or not always the wise decision to make, though it can be a learning from a previous decision, but not certainly you cannot apply just because it worked in a small sample set that it is going to work in a larger set. So let's look at what March and Simon describe as organizational structures for decision making. So S- March and Simon in their organization book actually describe three different models for organizational structures. This is the Metron model, the Selznick model, and the Gardner model, named after the people who actually proposed it as part of their papers or their research, which they conducted based on many organizations that they observed. If you see the Metron model, it's mainly centered around the organization being a tops down hierarchy with a lot of standard operating procedures. The consequences of a Metron model is basically reduction of personalized relationships. They basically said you don't really have to worry about how people interact, but more try to follow a playbook or a rule book. And it is a very rule based and a rigid behavior of a definition of status. But if you really see these three diagrams, there are two kinds of pointers. One is a solid pointer that says what the intention was and the unintended consequences that happened as a consequence of applying that particular model, like the Metron model. One of the very highlighted points by Martin Simon is that in the Metron model, what they saw is, let's say the performance of an employee is being, let's say an employee is thriving to excel in his area and tries to do a better performance. But the organization tends to reward the employees more on seniority rather than actual performance. This is a classic application of the Metron model. The other model that they suggest is called the Selznick model. The Selznick model is mainly based on training. So what Selznick suggested is if you can train the personnel in your organization to the specialization in which they are working, then you can achieve amazing results. And the delegation of authority and specialized competence is the highlight of this model. But what the consequence of such an application of the model was that when personnel leave the organization or due to dissatisfaction, where Simon discusses many options and on how a person could be dissatisfied and leave the organization incurs a cost of retraining and again doing the whole process all over again. The third framework that he suggests is called the Gardner model. In this Gardner model, it focuses on what is called acceptable minimum behavior. As long as the employees or the personnel in an organization or can perform at a certain minimum level, there is uh, there is an easier way to manage the organizational decision making, as now supervision is a little easier with the minimum acceptable behavior. But Gardner actually does leave a lot of aspects open-ended, as mentioned by Simon and March. Then he doesn't really explain why the failure of top management to use of such techniques is actually not very completely defined. So what we really see here is the implication or the bureaucracy of models being implied for decision making in an organization. Now let's shift gears and look at one of the chapters that Simon and March wrote, which is the chapter 7 on innovation. So let's look at first understand what innovation is and how innovation affects an organization. So, and how it's kind of related to decision making. Let's look at innovation in itself. So innovation can be of two types. One, you are trying to solve a problem for which you don't have a solution. It's basically a new problem that you have encountered. Or it could be a way to improve the present solution or problem, even when it was accepted as satisfactory. Here, I actually would like to present a use case which is a very recent observation in the electrical vehicle market. So Tesla, for example, is very well known, like you all know, in the electric car market. But Tesla started out as an electric car maker. They didn't have any historical way in the automotive production, whereas other companies like Ford and Toyota and others had traditionally been producing ICE engines or the internal combustion engine based thing. So when the whole shift in the market started towards green energy and electric cars, the inaction or the fact that the other organizations who are traditionally doing internal combustion engines thought that they can still rely on a revenue stream that originated from their other business and took the electric car market as a side thing. But we all know now how they are trying to play catch up. And this is exactly what we mean by action and inaction due to innovation. So actions that seek to innovate is one thing, and inactions that sometimes tend to stagnate an organization. This is the main difference between action and inaction in the organizational decision-making sense. So let's look at the innovation process by itself in detail. So March and Simon are describe many different ways in which the innovation process basically evolves. We will look at it in a couple of highlighted points here, and we will also look at certain other points in the next coming slide. So memory and problem solving. So memory and problem solving doesn't necessarily refer to everything memory, but it's mainly saying that searching previously solved problems of the same nature. This could involve patent search. This could involve actual physical search of records. It could be human experience or what we call as prior art. So this is one way of approaching innovation is to first go find out what others have done, what has been done in the same organization, whether we already have a solution before we actually invest in innovation. The basic problem solving process as described by them, by Simon and March, is that aggregating large amounts of information is the first step. And then you have to search that data, tag it, and then try to extract features or extract information from that data. Sometimes these search and screening is followed by a randomness of using the information that was gathered. Then programs and processes that govern problem solving use a very hierarchical structure. They try to see if each department is doing its part of the search and then aggregating that search data to solve the problem. The next aspect that they touch upon, where I actually haven't expanded a lot here, but there is details in the paper presented, is individual and group problem solving. Let's look at individual and group problem solving. Sometimes we tend to see that there are innovators or researchers or scientist type of roles where a single person is working on a problem day and night and tries to come. Whereas the other approach is called group problem solving. The advantage of having a group problem solving is mainly that you can now actually brainstorm and try to see how to solve the problem as a group. And then this enables breaking the problem down into smaller pieces and then aggregating the solution back into an innovative design. Then we'll look at what is called the occasions of innovation. what exactly we mean by occasion of innovation is sometimes the whole you're actually not looking for a solution to the current you're looking for a solution at a different instance, and they happen to produce an accidental nature of producing a different kind of a solution than the one being pursued. A very famous example that I have quoted even in the paper is the pharmaceutical companies which were looking for a drug for curing jet lag. But this process of you finding a drug for jet lag ended up producing a drug for called Viagra, which is extremely famous in the world. So you never know exactly what you're trying to find a solution for, but you accidentally stumble upon something else. The other part of the innovation is basically concept of optimum stress. So let's look at what concept of optimum stress. Sometimes if you leave innovation open-ended and there is no real deadlines associated, like it becomes a very open-ended research and it doesn't yield results on a time where you actually want it to be closed. Typically, the organizational stress is generally comes in an organizational decision making where the higher or upper management or bosses in the organization tend to put what is called deadlines. Deadlines serve as a benchmark against which innovation must be published, must show continuous improvement and results. So this is an extremely important part of innovation. The other thing is what is called institutionalization of innovation. What is institutionalization of innovation? So let's look at it a little deeper. I have an example right here where Intel, for example, has Intel Labs, where primarily a group of people are focused on research. They're all the time looking for new ways to solve problems, new products to produce. Google, on the other hand, actually took a slightly different approach. They said every employee must innovate, and they would give 20% of their time for innovation and self-development. So it's basically whether you want to institutionalize or don't want to institutionalize one of the ways in which innovation happens. Then lastly, we will look at timing of innovation. In a large organization, sometimes they do not operate in a tangible manner. And what's called as Grisham's law is basically daily routines. If you have a lot of daily routines given to people, they just get completely consumed in the daily routine, and that becomes their priority. And innovation and out-of-box thinking doesn't actually always happen in parallel. So there are many classic examples. I have actually quoted a couple of them here, where innovation basically changed the course of the industry. Like, for example, between Blockbuster Video and Netflix. Um, and also how iPod was invented when the inventor of iPod was actually working in a company called Real Audio, where at that time they thought music will be stored on hard disks in a PC kind of environment, whereas the person who was innovating was trying to think that it could be carried around. So it clearly shows different ways in which innovation has changed the course of the industry. Finally, we will look at how this whole topic that I just presented is relevant to ME597. I'm just going to list out a few things that we actually looked at in the process of the course. This is single and multi-attribute theory and decision making. If you look at project one, the presentation that I had done was around trying to choose a design of a camera for a particular problem that a ride-hailing company would use. If you really see, there are lots of decisions that are made based on feature analysis, or we tend to assign values, use lottery questions. This is decision making, literally, in an organizational approach. So even though many organizations don't really use these theories, but use of this theory in decision making will be extremely helpful for people. The other one is value of information. We also learned how a clairvoyant or an expert can change the direction of what actually happens in the decision-making process, right? So if you look at one of the problems that we looked at, where whether the decision to strike oil or not strike oil was affected by a consultant. If you really see in the industry today, value of information they do hire a lot of consultants like McKinsey and others to come and help organizations make decisions. If an organization has not looked at certain information, consultants come and make. And once you have a decision, you can assign probabilities to come up with better decision in a mathematical manner rather than just going by a qualitative way of looking at things. The other part that we learned was sequential decision making. In an organizational aspect, if you see, sequential decision making can help an organization, say, look at production capacity. So when we looked at the first a few slides where we talked about strategic, tactical, and operational decision making can be done in an organization using sequential decision making methods. Lastly, we dealt with group decision making. Group decision making is very relevant to an organization. If you have looked at agile based software development, a team gets together and tries to make a group decision on which features must be included and when it should be released, rather than a single ended tops down method where a manager tries to dictate how a product must be developed. So to conclude my project two, we looked at formal processes, we looked at types of decisions, we looked at how organizational structures for decision making are done, and we looked at innovation and its importance and its relationship to decision making. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and have a nice day. And I'd leave you with a lighter note with Dilbert. Thank you very much.